Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host for this evening, Catherine Reed. It may have been a minute since you've last seen me, but it's that time of the year again when we are doing a post-election analysis with one of my favorite pundits and analysts, Ben Tribbett. Thank you so much, Ben, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
You always bring such an interesting lens to these races. Oftentimes we have sat here and things that have surprised me have not surprised you. You have a great way of reading the markers and reading the indicators and explaining how something that looks like a surprise wasn't as much of a surprise as we thought. Let's talk a little bit about why this race was so different. It was redistricting, it was a lot of retirements. I mean, this race really was historically, I think, unique, this primary.
Yeah, I mean, obviously between the redistricting, retirements, and I think a willingness of challengers to step up and challenge longtime incumbents, almost nobody got a pass in this primary. For years, Virginia was a place where if there was a primary, there might be one or two and a couple of hot spots. And you look across the river at Maryland, every incumbent gets a challenge every time they're up for election. This was not our culture here. I think this is a new culture that we're now experiencing where incumbents should expect to have a contest every 4 years or 2 years, depending on their office, and they should be prepared for that.
So back in 2017, when we kind of swept the House in Prince William, and everybody was surprised, and yet you weren't as surprised as the rest of us were, and you were saying that once you knew the first couple of seats were going to go to the Democrats, that you knew that it was going to be this kind of sea change that would take us to a place we really didn't hope we would be. Prince William is kind of a bellwether in a lot of ways. Do you still see Prince William that way?
Yeah, I think Prince William was a bellwether to what was happening. I mean, one of the things that prior to 2017 that was going on was Democrats were winning a lot of seats in the House of Delegates at the statewide level, but it wasn't translating to the legislative level. So Terry McAuliffe carried almost half of the seats in the General Assembly in 2013 when he ran for governor, but he only came out with 34 Democratic delegates. There was a large crossover vote that was going on for Democrats statewide and local Republicans that people knew and trusted. By 2017 and with Donald Trump, that dam broke. And people no longer wanted to split their tickets. They started voting a straight ticket down the line, and as soon as that happened, essentially what Democrats picked up in 17 was every single district that Hillary Clinton had carried the year before. And since then, you're seeing a much more polarized General Assembly, where what really matters is what are the national results, much more so than how strong is a local incumbent.
So two of the women who won in Prince William County, Hala Ayala and Jennifer Carroll Foy, and we've talked about this in previous shows. It's kind of like they were hardly in the House for a minute, and then Hala ran for lieutenant governor. Jennifer Carroll Foy ran for the nomination for governor. Neither one of them prevailed. Hala won the primary, but not in the general. And then we see them facing off this year. I mean, it seemed to me that was a pretty quick arc from where they started and where they ended up.
Yeah, I don't even know how to respond to that other than to say it's incredibly fast. What's going on all over the state is it's historically fast because a lot of these areas that didn't have representation before, there was no Democratic establishment to step up and run for the next highest office. So whether it was the state Senate seat or if, say, for example, Abigail Spanberger wasn't running and that congressional seat that's mostly Prince William County opened up, you just see an influx of candidates coming in because everyone who's won there at lower offices is putting their hand up saying, why not me?
And so staying with Prince William, Elizabeth Guzman stepped up to challenge Jeremy McPike, but that's because she was drawn into a district with Luke Torian, who is very much a senior member in the House.
Right.
And then, so Jeremy McPike hung on to his seat. Danica Rome decided to move from the House to the Senate. You know, so there was just a lot of movement in Prince William. And before the show started, we were talking about Ann Wheeler, who was the Democratic chair of the Prince William Board of Supervisors, who, to my surprise, ended up being primaried out of that seat.
Right, and you know, there's obviously a lot of unique issues that are going on in Prince William County, and Ann, you know, had a really difficult time in the western end of the county. It's actually where she's from. It was a little bit ironic in that where her strength was, and why Democrats had asked her to run for chair to begin with, was she had run very strong in the western part of the county 12 years ago for supervisor. So when they were looking for a countywide candidate, they turned to her to say, why don't you run countywide? And the West ended up sort of being her undoing. She couldn't make up the margin she needed in the East because Deshandra was able to sort of piece together coalitions in different neighborhoods and precincts that kept Ann from sort of running the table in the South and the East. And those margins in the North she couldn't overcome.
And this is where I think that your superpower is your reading of precincts. Like how different precincts might be in the same county or in the same district, but precincts can behave very differently within, and now we've got all new districts because everything's been redrawn. So suddenly people are in a district where an incumbent may be running who's in part of the district and in another. So in Northern Virginia, that happened quite a bit. So one of the big upsets, I think, was the Chap Peterson, Saddam Salim, because that district also changed and incorporated part of Tyson's Corner and part of Falls Church City. What do you?
All of Falls Church City.
All of Falls Church City. So, how do you read the behavior of the district?
Well, I think, when I think of what happened with Chap's primary, the sort of the first reaction I had to it was watching Democratic activists over the last 20 years in Northern Virginia. There's been a yearning for primarying Dick Saslaw and Chap Peterson for every 4 years. There's rumors that it's going to happen. And in 2007, they were able to clear the field because the Senate was at stake, and people were willing to step back and say, well, Chap is the strongest candidate to go unseat the Republican candidate. But even then, there was talk about primarying Dick Saslaw, and it didn't happen that year. In 2011, there was more talk about, is Dick Saslaw or Chap Peterson going to get primaried? In 2015, it was back again. And it wasn't until 2019 that Dick finally got primaried. But there's always been this discussion and this part of the base that wanted to see these primaries happen. And when I watched some of the social media around Saddam's campaign, I recognized a lot of the faces that were at his rallies, that were at his canvasses, as the people who have been complaining about their representation for a decade. And for whatever reason, their concerns were never quelled. And so it essentially gave him a built-in base that I think, when you combine that with redistricting and with some of the issues that were going on in Richmond over the last couple of years, made for a really toxic environment for the incumbent. I mean, one of the things that I put this up on Twitter the other day, but outside the Beltway, if you take out the Republican vote, I think that Chap and Saddam were essentially 50-50 among Democrats. That's Chap's base outside the Beltway. And inside the Beltway, I think it was about 3-1 amongst Democrats for Saddam. And then what tightened up the race a little bit from there is some crossover voting that came out for Chap. But you can't make up those kind of margins with crossover voting. You have to have a base. And Chap just didn't tend to his base and didn't have a base.
So the other kind of tight race adjacent is George Barker and Stella Pekarsky. And Stella was one of several Fairfax County Public School Board members who ran, joined by Laura Jane Cohen and Karen Keyes Gamara, both of whom also won their races. So 3 school board members who stepped up, ran, and won their races. Is this something we should expect to see in the future? Like, really, is the school board the runway for some of these seats?
Yeah. From the time school board started getting elected in 95 until Ryan McElveen ran for chair, and then Carl Frisch lost a race last year as well, all the school board members have won every nomination fight they had been in. Northern Virginia is really big, the districts, I mean, and it's hard to get name ID. And so being a member of the school board and being someone who is involved with the #1 employment center in your district, which for almost every one of these districts, the #1 employer is FCPS, is a huge advantage for school board candidates. They're absolutely, when school board candidates lose, it's monumental upsets, because for them to lose means that someone has somehow moved past a huge name ID advantage, which is the hardest thing to do in politics. When we were testing some of these races in the last couple of weeks, you'd be shocked at how low name ID is, whether they won or lost of these candidates, even in a Democratic primary activist electorate. A lot of people don't know who these candidates are at the local level. And so name ID is so important. and these school board members are known in the community.
Yeah, Tom likes to quiz people on airplanes about who their representative is. I've had to tell him to stop doing that. It's embarrassing. Tom will go, oh, so Kim Plum must be your representative, and they're like, who? I'm like, Tom, please stop doing that. Right. It's uncomfortable for people. But anyway, speaking of Kim Plum, he decided to retire, the most senior member in the House of Delegates, and there were 4 candidates in this primary, strong candidates in this primary, and Karen Keyes-Gamarra ended up prevailing with, I think, 37% of the vote. You know, 3 ways are tough, but 4 ways, you know, there's another race that you and I were talking about down in the Hampton Roads area with Kelly Fowler, and the fact that she wasn't going to run, then she was going to run. That was a 4-way race where each of those candidates got 20-some% of the vote. So you've got a candidate who's going into a general election. Karen Keyes-Gamarra is going in with 37%, but it's a reliably blue district.
Sure.
But what if somebody comes in with 28% of the vote and it's a more competitive district? How do you read things like that?
Yeah, I think generally from primary electorates, they'll consolidate to general elections. I don't think you usually have a problem with your primary electorate, no matter how strong or weak you were once you go to the general. I think there's different factors that go into it. However, you know, you do have a problem if you have a low performance in the next election. I think Karen's challenge is that district's centered in Reston, and she's not from Reston. And so she's always going to be vulnerable in that seat to someone from the community in Reston because so much of the population base is in Reston. You know, it's very, very difficult in Northern Virginia primaries to piece together people to know you when you're not from their community. And you can see that in all these elections. You know, George Barker represented 3 precincts before he ran in the Senate seat. It was very difficult for him to get known across Centerville and Chantilly. And I'm sure to someone like the Washington Post editorial board who came in and endorsed all the incumbents, they probably thought, well, what's the difference between Springfield and Centerville? It's a huge deal to the voters.
It's a huge difference. Even within, like I said, even within some districts, you think about what is the difference between Fairfax City, Falls Church City, Tyson's Corner, and Vienna. Mm-hmm. Those communities would say, there's enormous, we are not like all the same.
Sure, they're our own worlds.
They're definitely our own world. So we are going to go to a short break. When we come back, I want to talk some more about some of these races and what you think it means for the general election, and talk about how women won big. You know, it's taken forever for women to get traction in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but it seems like after 2015, suddenly women have arrived. So please join us after the break. We are talking with Ben Tribbett about post-election analysis.
Every day across America, excess food is gathered by a network of good people at local food banks, giving hope to millions of children who struggle with hunger. They've earned their wings, and you can too. Together, we can solve child hunger. Support Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
Hi, I'm Josh Temple. You might have seen me on TV where I help folks turn their houses into dream homes. But forget construction. Parenting is the toughest job there is. So when you need help or advice, turn to the parenting experts at Boys Town.
I was afraid of that.
Well, guess it's time to get you fixed.
Your pets will start fooling around sooner than you think.
Go on, get out of here!
Accidental litters lead to millions killed in shelters each year. Help prevent more. Fix at month 4.
Food. It nourishes, brings us together, and adds flavor to life. That's why it's important to wash hands, surfaces, and fresh produce. Keep raw meat, poultry, and seafood separate from ready-to-eat foods like fruits and vegetables. And cook to proper temperatures using a food thermometer. Enjoy, and refrigerate leftovers within 2 hours. For more tips on safely preparing foods, visit homefoodsafety.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host for the evening, Catherine Reed, and tonight I'm talking with Ben Tribbett, who is a well-known political analyst here in Virginia. He's been doing this for decades, literally since high school, as I recall. So can we talk about women? Can we talk about women in politics and how hopeless it seemed not that long ago, 10 years ago, back in 2013, which is just so impossible to think about. We had so few women in the legislature. And then starting in 2015, 2017, 2019, but let's talk about all the women who won on the 20th. So many women, some of whom have been literally running in multiple races for about 10 years. What do you attribute this to?
Well, first of all, in Democratic primaries, Democrats vote, and women are predominantly Democratic. So Democratic primaries tilt overwhelmingly to women, particularly in districts with heavier minority populations, just because women in African American districts tend to really, really, really vote. And so just as an example of this, we worked for Senator Lucas this cycle in her primary. In the early vote, 46% of the entire electorate was black women.
Wow.
So
wow.
When people were asking me, well, how is she doing? Is she going to be able to survive this? And I'm like, looks pretty good, right? I also think that, Donald Trump, we got to give him a lot of credit for this. There's a couple things Donald Trump gets a ton of credit for. Number one is massively expanding the civic engagement in this country.
Hugely.
Turnout record highs on both sides, right? So we can thank him for that. And we can thank him for electing a lot of women. Because once Donald Trump got elected, one of the things that women voters started doing was voting for other women. And women were always dominating the Democratic primaries in terms of the electorate, but women candidates were not dominating, which means we know the women in the electorate were not voting for women candidates. All of a sudden that changed. In 2017, remember the primaries, every single woman running against a man won the Democratic primary in 2017. Jennifer Carroll Foy won the primary from her hospital bed. She wasn't even at the polls.
That's right. Having given birth prematurely to twins.
Right. So, it was the year of the woman. That's continuing because women are continuing to want to vote for female candidates. And I think you put your finger on it when we were offset of a lot of minority women as well. You've seen a lot of women wanting to vote for women of color. And they're doing very well in primaries all over the state. A secret weapon into future primaries as people look forward into where you might see challenges. I think that a minority woman, had they fielded against, say, for Commonwealth's attorney in Fairfax this year, instead of another older white man, would have been a much greater challenge to Steve Descano. I remember when I was working with Ray Morrow 4 years earlier, when they said Steve Descano was running, I was like, whew, not that it was a guaranteed that he would win,
right.
But thank goodness they did not run an African American woman, because there was no path. For him to get reelected against an African American woman. And I think the same thing applies now. It's very, very difficult to beat African American women in Democratic primaries because they're so represented, but also you see a lot of the older white women want to vote for women of color. And so it gives a minority woman a huge leg up in a primary.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, and we definitely have seen some fresh faces around the Commonwealth, women of color who won this year. But I think about, too, women with young children, which also, I think at one point when Eileen Fillercorn was in the House, she was the only woman in the House with school-aged children, and they were in high school. And now you have Kathy Tran, and you've got all these women who, Stella Pekarsky's got 6 kids. Right? Holly Siebold has 2 kids in school. All of these women who are also moms of school-aged children. That's also this new trend we've never had in Virginia politics before.
And women running, giving childbirth during the election.
I know, right?
Heidi didn't make it, but same thing as Jennifer 4 years, or 6 years ago. But this is it's a whole new world. And I heard from a lot of voters that they really appreciate these younger moms that are running because they know how much work they're putting in. And I know when George Barker was hitting Stella on, sort of typical political back and forth, the backlash was coming from parents and young parents, particularly young mothers, who were saying, like, when he said, well, she hasn't accomplished anything, and they're like, no, she...
Running a business, mother of 6, and on the school board. I think she might have done a few things.
She's done a few things. And you know, the first thing people say about her when they remember, like, you know, like Stella Pekarsky, they're like, she has 1.5 million children.
1.5 million children, there you go. Yeah, more than her share. But, you know, and I think about the women, too, who ran and won this year. Amy Laufer has run, this is her 3rd election, and she finally won. But I remember meeting her back when we formed Virginia's List. And Amy's actually the one who suggested calling it Virginia's List, and she had started an organization. We had one here in Northern Virginia that Julie Jakopic had started. And so many of these women who ran this year, too, I have met 10, 12, 15 years ago. And it's nice to see them finally gaining some traction, although Susan Hippen ran in a 4-way race, and I also met Susan through Emerge, and she did not prevail. And these women...
Against another woman.
Yeah, and that's just women who keep at it. Even though they don't win the first time or the second time, they keep coming back because they are committed to giving back to their community, and this is how they've decided to do it. What were some of the more interesting races? You had a candidate that you worked with down in Hampton Roads, too. Andrea McClellan is somebody else that I met through Emerge, but she had a wonderful challenger. Yeah,
we worked with Angela Williams-Graves, who was formerly on the Norfolk City Council, then went to the House of Delegates, I think, for 2 years before she went for the Senate. You know, this is Yvonne Miller's old Senate seat in Norfolk. It's a seat that is, Norfolk is a place that is a special place. And they all got drawn into it, one district once again, which Norfolk had not been. It had been split up into multiple districts in the last few redistrictings, where there had been sometimes senators from Norfolk, other times Lionel Spruill had represented the vast part of the city living in Chesapeake. I think when he was elected, for a while there was no senators from the city of Norfolk. So this was really a fight between 2 candidates who both had very good name ID in the city. And it's a safe Democratic seat, so it's one of those elections that the winner probably will be there for quite some time.
Right, and there are districts, although I'm kind of losing track of them with redistricting because I don't have a really quality map. I yearn for a quality map, but I don't have a quality map. But, you know, in some cases, like in Fauquier County, where there was a wonderful candidate who won in what is, I guess, majority Jill Vogel's old seat in Fauquier. But again, it was redrawn to include Loudoun. So in my mind, you know, we were talking before the show, and I'm like, is that a competitive district now? I mean, are some of these districts more competitive than they were? Do Democrats have a shot in some of these newly drawn districts?
Yeah, so that seat is actually considered the 21st most Democratic seat.
Really?
Yeah. So in a hypothetical where it followed exact performance, that would be the majority maker seat. I'm not a big believer in that. The 22nd seat, for example, is Monty Mason. I think that Monty Mason's more likely to be the 21st seat in a scenario where we need 21 than the Loudoun seat. But I think the Loudoun seat is very close to that line. And in these new seats, Democrats could win up to 25 seats. But there's 23 that look very good for Democrats if they can turn their voters out. But you know, these off-year elections are light turnout, and Republicans tend to do very well in places like Western Loudoun County in low turnout elections. And so, you know, we still have a long way to go in this cycle before we know Democrats will even win the majority, let alone take 22 or 23 seats.
So let's go back. I always try to assume that not everybody understands how politics works in Virginia and about the 4-year cycle and the fact that we're one of only 2 states. So maybe you could just give everybody a little condensed lesson about why there's such a terrible voter terrible voter turnout in the 4th year.
Right. Well, so presidential years always happen 2016, 2020, coming up in 2024. The next year after that is always the governor's election. And that tends to be historically about half of the turnout of the presidential. Again, in the post-Trump era, it's now more like 3/4 of the turnout, massive increase of that, but it's lower in the presidential years. And then you have a midterm federal year, which if there's contests on the ballot, tends to be similar to the governor's year in turnout, sometimes even a little bit better. Then in the 4th year, the year before the presidential contest, when all these state and many local offices are up, we have another election. There is nothing on the statewide ballot to drive turnout, and the turnout plummets. oftentimes to less than a third of what we get in a presidential election.
And I think people just don't understand. I was looking at the actual numbers of people who voted in these primaries. It's so small that it's just incredible how small it is. And I think people are not understanding that because of this off-year cycle, which, you know, it's not a bug, it's a feature for how it's done in Virginia. We're one of only 2 states that have off-year governor's elections. But all of the local races, the ones closest to your door, the ones that impact you most directly, are in a year when hardly anyone votes.
Yeah, and you know, there were a lot of candidates this year that were pushing for non-traditional voters to come out and vote. Whether that was Republican crossover or independents or different ethnic groups or whatever, they were trying to go in the electorate to expand the electorate. It's still very, very light, even with that massive expenditures from these groups to increase the size of the electorate. It's just, you know, some of this is baked in. And what I always say about Democratic primaries, the first thing I tell every candidate I meet with that wants to run a Democratic primary is that there's some voters that are worth 2 votes, and there's some voters that are worth 1 vote. And the voters that are worth 2 votes are the regular primary voters. People like you or me who vote in every single primary election. Because we're guaranteed to vote, we're either +1 or -1 for you. So that's a 2-vote swing. When I bring somebody out to vote that's not a traditional voter, they're either 0 or +1. You can't win with people worth 1 vote if you don't at least get extremely competitive among people worth 2 votes. Amongst how the Democrats vote, the regular Democratic primary voters carry 95% of primaries. And the only times they don't, where there's a slight variation, it might be 52-48, 53-47. If it gets much beyond 55-45, forget about it. You have to get at least 45% and probably a little bit more of the core Democratic primary voters to have any chance in a Democratic primary. You can't just, every candidate, you know, seems to imagine that they're going to be the person who's going to turn out these massive numbers of new voters. It's not going to happen.
No, I have seen that. And I think the other, and we can talk about this after our break, I think the other one is young voters. I believe I've seen an increase in younger voters turning out, but they historically have been fairly unreliable. You know, lots of activity, lots of rallies, but as far as registering and actually getting out to vote, they're not a particularly reliable vote. But I also, when we come back from the break, want to talk about the expansion of the early voting and same-day voting and the impacts, because I can tell you from personal experience, same-day voting makes an enormous amount of difference. So don't go anywhere, because we are talking with Ben Tribbett, who is a well-known political analyst in Virginia, about the post-primary results.
Here we are, 2013. We all depend on technology to communicate, to bank, and none of us know how to read and write code.
The first program I wrote asked things like, what's your favorite color? Or how old are you?
I wrote a program to play tic-tac-toe.
I first learned how to make a green circle and a red square appear on the screen.
You're just trying to make something, trying to transfer something from your mind to the computer or to a tablet. It's an experience.
The whole limit in the system is just that there just aren't enough people who are trained and have these skills today.
The programmers of tomorrow are the wizards of the future. You know, you're going to look like you have magic powers compared to everybody else.
Great coders are today's rock stars. That's it.
You've known for years that this is the #1 cause of lung cancer, smoking. That's why the Surgeon General issued this warning. But do you know the #1 cause of lung cancer for non-smokers? It's in this room. You can't see it or smell it. It's radon. Radon is an invisible radioactive gas that seeps inside your home from underground. It can build up to dangerous levels without notice. Now the Surgeon General has issued another lung cancer warning. And whether you smoke or not, breathing radon can cause lung cancer. That's why you need to have your home tested. Protect your family. Call 1-800-SOS-RADON. Heed the warning. Have your home tested, because radon problems can be fixed.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host for the evening, Catherine Reed, and I'm talking with Ben Tribbett about the primary that was held here last Tuesday. So Ben, let's talk about young people. I personally love young people. Of course, you get to a certain age and everybody under 40 looks very young. So young is a spectrum. But let's talk about younger than that people. There have been a lot of, there were people who worked, young people who worked on my campaign. I saw young people working on campaigns across the state. The expansion of early voting to 45 days, I'm going to say anecdotally, seems to have made a difference for Democrats. But also the same day voter registration and the provisional ballots, which actually means on election night, we don't necessarily know who won. How has that impacted, do things like same day registration, do you think that's impacted participation by young people?
Sure, it's absolutely increased it. Anytime you make voting easier, older people can figure out a way to go vote. If there's a hurricane rolling through their town on a primary day for 12 and a half hours, they will schedule the half hour that they can get to the polls and go vote, right? Younger people, especially people who are transient, have a lot more difficulty doing that, especially in these communities where not everyone has a car.
Right.
Can be very difficult for young people to vote. So having a lot of voting availability helps them a lot. I will say the biggest voting reform that happened was actually the most under the radar one. And we got to give Schuyler Van Valkenburg credit for this because it was a bill he put in no one asked for when all these voting reforms were passing in 2020, and that is this permanent absentee list.
Oh my gosh, people I know are on it.
It is insane the advantage the Democrats have from this, because what happened after that bill passed was Donald Trump told people not to vote by mail. And on our applications to get an absentee ballot for the presidential election, there was a box you could check for a permanent general election or primary ballot. And so in these primaries, a lot of the votes are sent out a month in advance of the election now. So there's actually 2 election days that you're really working towards. And you can see and there's almost no crossover in the mail votes because of that either. And you can see that the candidates, that's how you're able to tell how they're doing with base Democratic voters, is the mail ballots. And they're coming in. Aaron Rouse was slaughtered on election day in Virginia Beach in the special election. I think he lost by 16 points. He was still elected in a Republican seat as the senator because the early vote was so huge for him. You go through all these primaries, we go through race by race. The person who won the early vote almost always won the primary because the early vote, again, was an indicator of where the Democratic base was, and the Democratic base drives these elections.
Well, I love your concept of, some people count as 2 votes. Like, this is a new one. I have not heard that before tonight, Ben, but now it's in my mind. So, and I get it. I get that that's the person we want early voting. That's the person we want permanent absentee, because then even if they forget that there's a primary or they're, it's just not on their radar, it's going to show up in the mail and remind them to vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, look, there's voters that are perfect voters. And you don't have to do anything to turn them out. They will go vote. Everybody else needs some help. And when you look at what percentage of the perfect voters are, people that are like you and me, we are a pretty big minority.
We are, and it's because there's so many. So if you think about it, it's when people say, "Oh, I vote in every election," and then you drill down, and it's like, no, they vote in every presidential election. Right. Well, in Virginia, we have so much more than that. Mm-hmm. We've got the 4 elections plus the primaries, presidential, and then the other primaries beyond the presidential primary. We got rid of the May elections. People have feelings about that. I personally feel very good about having gotten rid of the May elections. We didn't need an extra election every other year that people didn't vote in. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, we suffer from voter fatigue here in Virginia. The fatigue is real.
Right. I remember in Arlington when Mary Margaret Whipple was in office. She left in 2011, so we're talking almost 20 years ago. Frank O'Leary was the treasurer of Arlington. He used to help elect candidate after candidate after candidate in Arlington through the very difficult Democratic primaries of Arlington, which are the hardest in the state. But he had a system of every time you voted in a Democratic primary, you got a point, up to 15 points. And they would go through and work everyone who had 15 points, then every voter that had 14 points, 13 points, 12 points, because those people were going to come out to vote. And once they locked down those voters, their candidates never lost.
Oh, wow. So that's like counting noses among...
Because like, think of like a 30-year-old that's transient and then it's Democrat in your area. Maybe they voted in a couple presidential primaries. They're worth 2 points. They could come out, but they're not guaranteed to come out. Someone who's never voted in a primary before, it's possible they could choose at that one time to do it. But what my experience has been is that when I look at lists of people that are voting, if I'm in touch with that community, I knew all the names. So like when I was looking this year at the early vote in Fairfax City, for example, I've done a lot of campaigns in Fairfax City. I knew all the names. I don't know all those people personally, but I knew exactly who those people were, and I knew what their connections were to the different candidates. That's not, when you bring out independent voters that like you know personally, every candidate does that. Every candidate has Republicans or independents that like them personally that come out and vote for them, some more than others. That's not the same thing as engaging this broader community to come out and come into a primary. And what I was looking for, and I was looking at that stuff as the election was getting closer, was for Chap to have a chance to win in his primary, I needed to start seeing names I didn't know. Because that would tell me, okay, these people in the community that are supporting him that may not be Democrats that are coming in the electorate were bringing their friends. They were not. They were coming for him. They were not bringing others with them. And that to me was like, when I saw that, I was like, you know, this is going to be very difficult for him.
So that, you know, so a lot of this is kind of insider baseball in voter lists and who has and hasn't voted. You don't know how someone voted, but you can tell if someone voted. So doing mailers as a candidate, if you're doing mailers only to people who haven't voted, there's a world of information that tells you, there is a list that tells you who has voted. And people working on campaigns have access to that information. People at home don't necessarily have access to that information. Right. So for you to have your finger on the pulse of not just how many, but who, and tying that to a base that you know is, in this instance, is Democratic, kind of gave you a window into results even before Election Day.
Right. You start to see, like, you know, when I'm working with Senator Lucas and we see 46% of the primary electorate is black women, we don't know how they voted, but we feel really good.
You feel really good about that.
Feel really good
I
about
can
it.
imagine. I can imagine.
And we won early vote by over 1,000 votes. And I think it was over half of her margin came out of the early vote. In fact, as the election day precincts came in first on election night, people were freaking out. They thought she had lost the election because she was only up about 300 votes in Portsmouth with all of election day reporting in. We're like, she can't survive with 300 vote margin in her home city. That's because the early vote was sitting there with a treasure trove for her. I think yours, when you ran for mayor, came in the opposite way. I think the early vote came in first. In Virginia, the law changed. It used to be you had to wait to open the ballots until 7 p.m., so early vote would always come in last. General Assembly updated that a few years ago, so you can open it on election day before the polls close, as long as they're sequestered in a room where no one can see the results. And so in some places there are better organized offices, the early vote reports first. And depending on the order of how the election's reporting, you know, when I sit there on election night, that means vastly different things to me of like what we're looking at. Because I had, my phone was blowing up with people, I mean, in full meltdown that she was gone. That, like, you know, none of Chesapeake is in. She's up 300 votes in the city of Portsmouth. She is toast. And I'm just like, wait for the early vote, wait for the early vote. You know, and when it came, she never trailed again the rest of the night. This methodology of how people are voting and what they're doing is dramatically changing how elections are run, how they're won. You know, and if it's always awkward to talk about, like, you know, elections when, like, we're even the ones in where you're not on the ballot, you know, ones that overlap with you because it's different, right?
Right.
But, like, I think of, like, your election in mayor is, like, a good example of, like, when you're coming as a challenger to an established person, like you were running against a city council member who was sort of the establishment pick, you should be trailing going into election day because he should build up a big advantage in the early vote because he's known better than you early on, right? He has a big advantage. Because of the skew of the electorate of, like, how these early votes go, instead of you trailing going into election day, you're building up margin going into election day. You go into election day, what did you win early vote by? 1,000 votes or something. You went into election day with this humongous lead that like it's like almost daring them, okay, come catch up. You know, like you got to go make up 1,000 votes because there's plenty of your voters that are still coming out on election day. That is almost impossible for a candidate. And you know, I think Republicans are going to have to put a major investment into getting their voters to sign up for early voting, or they're going to continue to get trounced in these lower turnout elections because they're handing us these seats when they let us go into election day with a huge lead. That's never happened before, at least in Virginia, where candidates, you know, have this kind of built-in advantage, and it is in every single seat in the state, thanks to Donald Trump. I think that in the early vote, we could expect to see 30 of 40 Senate candidates this year after the early vote, go into election day with the lead for Democrats. Now, we're not going to win 30 seats, but that's how big that advantage is.
Well, that gives me a lot of hope. I mean, I always knew it was math, but there's more to math than meets the eye. It's not simple addition and subtraction. So what about these provisional ballots? Who is voting same day besides college students? And we do live next door to George Mason University.
Transient voters, people who go to the wrong precinct. It's not a huge vote, the provisional vote, but at the end of an election can make the difference. Primaries doesn't usually make a big difference, but in the general elections, the provisionals tend to lean 3 or 4 to 1 Democratic. And so if you're just getting close on election day with the final results, a Democratic candidate can expect to pick up some votes 3 days after when they count the provisionals.
But anymore, we can't really rely on election night as being election night. It's more like it's election month. Well, I guess for the close when there's recounts. But you know, everybody kept warning in the last.
Oh, you mean after? I'm talking about before. So you're talking about the aftermath of election day.
Yeah,
I've seen election month before, but yeah, then there's 2 weeks after.
But there's because there's this time afterward when it's like, well, here's on election day, but you don't know, the viewer or the people don't know how many provisional ballots there are to be counted. So in small races, it can make the difference between winning and losing. It certainly did in Fairfax City. We're going to go to another break. But I do want to drive home to our viewers all the ways in which they need to pay attention to how these things not only have changed, how they impact the outcome, and why we should all look at things like permanent absentee voting, because there are people who've signed up for that. And it means that you don't have to worry about seeing signs or yard signs. The fact of the matter is something's going to show up in your mailbox that's going to tell you, hey, it's time to vote for your congressman, your president, your governor. And so things to take home, things to take notes about. When we come back from our break, we are going to wrap up by talking with what we think is going to happen in the general election here in Virginia. So join us.
It's a beautiful day out here. Sunny today with light breezes, giving way to clouds in the afternoon. We could see some light precipitation to moderate precipitation later on, followed by powerful storm-like conditions. 90 miles per hour winds are expected. Authorities are asking everyone, stay indoors. Come on, that's it. Let's go.
Oh, Dad, wait till you see the bike we got for Jake.
Hearing loss happens gradually with age, making it easy to ignore. Yet most older Americans aren't getting their hearing tested. Untreated hearing loss can keep your loved ones from enjoying what they cherish most.
Dad, can you hear me?
Don't let that happen. Speak up about hearing loss. You'll be glad you did.
You can't buy a best friend. You can love them, pet them, care for them, whether they want you to or not. You can take a picture, you can jump, yell, you can fly to the moon, travel the world, or just stay in bed. You can't buy a best friend like that, but you can adopt one. 'Cause we're connected.
Cook foods to the right temperature using a food thermometer. 3,000 Americans will die from food poisoning this year. Keep your family safer. Check your steps at foodsafety.gov.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host for the evening, Catherine Reed, and I'm talking with Ben Tribbett, and we are doing a post-primary election analysis of what happened last Tuesday. So, Ben, we can't really just act like Democrats were the only people who had primaries. They were not the only people. Republicans also had primaries, including in Northern Virginia. Not that we have a lot of seats in Northern Virginia that are represented by Republicans. But let's talk about David LaRocque, who was quite the character. And there ended up being like 8 people who ran in that primary. What does that say when you've got 8 people who come out for a seat?
Yeah, new seat, Northern Shenandoah Valley, Senate District 1 now. And David LaRocque actually led all through most of election night up until the results came in from Shenandoah County. And I don't even know this gentleman's name who won.
Timmy French?
Timmy French.
Yeah.
He's from Shenandoah County. Apparently he has a very large, enthusiastic base in Shenandoah County. And the results flipped. He ended up winning by over 1,000 votes. And so, you know, what that means for the General Assembly in terms of, you know, what his difference is from David LaRocque, I mean, he can't be worse.
I can't imagine.
So, but, you know, I think that this is a regional fight, and these Republican primaries, because they're so rural now, there's a lot of localities that are in the primaries. And so it has a lot to do with where you live and the geography and the intensity in your geography, and a lot less to do with ideology, because they're all very conservative candidates. We were also going to talk about that Ren Williams primary with
Marie March. And of course, so
it started with a fight.
It literally, and they, you know, she accused him of assaulting her because he bumped into her, and it just became this whole thing. But the thing about that particular race is because she is in Christiansburg. I mean, Christiansburg is part of that district. And I grew up there. I went to elementary school in Christiansburg. And so the previous incumbent, Nick Rush, who was a Republican from Christiansburg, we had numerous conversations. He was an interesting person to talk to. He represented his district well. He was a Republican, but just somebody you could talk to. And we had mutual friends, and it was all like, you could get along, right? And then with his departure, and Marie March was really very much a Trump and heels kind of candidate, running against other candidates, somebody from the Board of Supervisors in Montgomery County. I mean, you know, people who'd been in politics, and but so she won. But then she and Ren Williams went at it, and it was kind of one of the marquee talked about races, just because it was kind of so out there.
Yeah, Ren Williams, I think, was Trump's lawyer, and he won his own open seat just a couple years ago. So I think they were both first term.
They were in different districts.
In different districts.
And they were drawn into the one district.
Right. And, you know, I think that, you know, from a Republican perspective right now, if you're a moderate Republican, and by moderate, I use that term loosely, but we'll call it establishment Republican, a lot of them don't want to run for office right now because they know what they're going to face in these primaries, which is an extremely Trumpy electorate that's looking to overthrow anyone who has even the slightest sniff of establishment support. And that's what they want to send to Richmond, and that's where you're going to get the Marie Marches of the world. Now, I think Ren Williams was able to sort of navigate that because he's also very Trumpy himself, and he also had a big geographic advantage in this primary and the way the district was drawn.
And then another interesting race was Trish White Boyd, who is in Roanoke, and she's on the city council, and she ran against another city council member, Luke Priddy, and she prevailed in the primary, but now she's running against an incumbent, David Suterline.
Yeah,
they're in the
combined.
same district. And, you know, what are the possibilities, and I love Trish, I mean, what are the possibilities that is even a competitive seat?
It's competitive, but I think Suterline has the advantage. You know, Roanoke is an area that, depending on how you draw it, you can make a Democratic seat, you can make a competitive seat, or you could make all safe Republican seats. The Republicans were gerrymandering now. The city of Roanoke is small enough, even though it's very Democratic, that they could split it into pieces and every seat could be Republican in the area. But it's also enough Democrats between the city of Roanoke and Blacksburg that when they drew that together, John Edwards had a fairly safe seat for the last 10 years. Now they've split it where the seat does go into Montgomery County, but it does not get to Blacksburg. And so the city of Roanoke is a political minority in the district versus being with a continuity area that it has. Blacksburg and Roanoke very much have a similar interest in terms of politics, very similar politics. So it's going to be uphill for her, but it's not impossible because there is a base in that district. It's just that Roanoke County has become so Republican. It used to be that when you combine the city and county, they were about even. Since the 2000 election, every cycle, the margins for Republicans have increased in the county. The city margins have not really increased for the Democrats. And by now, the county margins dwarf the city.
You know, and that's what's so odd about Roanoke City being inside Roanoke County. It's kind of like Austin, Texas being inside Austin. I mean, Austin being inside Texas is a blue dot in this really very, very red place. And there's all Democrats on the city council in Roanoke, and there have been for years. Mm-hmm. And it's Dwayne Yancey wrote about this in Cardinal News about how they need to re-examine how they have broken up the wards in Roanoke, because you're right, how you draw the lines vastly impacts the makeup of the seat. And so it's all been Democrats in the city. But you get outside that city and you in the county is very Republican. And it's a bit of a distance until Blacksburg, which is where Virginia Tech is, and Radford University is right next door. So you've got a bit of a university community there, which has an impact generally. But this brings me fully back to, but do students vote? Do the students at Tech vote locally, or do they vote in their home territory? There's a lot of students at Tech who actually live in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, in 2017, the students in Tech came out in massive numbers and elected Chris Hurst. And in 2021, they did not come back. And that's why he lost his seat. So it can widely vary. I think there was a lot of resources put into student voting in 2017. And Tom Steyer was actually doing that. I don't think his organization's doing that anymore at the same level. And you saw turnout fall off in places where resources were not put into the universities. You need resources to get students out to vote because you need to have events, you need to put things together to get them through the process of registering, knowing where to go. That's expensive, but it can really pay off for a campaign if they make that investment.
And it'd be great to see the data on that. I don't know that anybody's necessarily tracking the really, we all guess about students voting, but I've always looked at them as enthusiastic activists, supporters. They'll door knock, they'll do all kinds of things, but not a very reliable sector of the electorate for the Democrats or the Republicans.
And from my memory, there was a big problem with Democratic turnout in 2021 in Blacksburg and Harrisonburg. But there was not, at VCU, but UVA, William & Mary, and George Mason actually turned out in similar numbers, that they did not have the same problem in turnout. So it can really vary by campus. It's not just who the statewide candidates are and what their message is. It's about the organization on campus and who's putting in the work to turn out those voters.
No, I think it makes it. People I think sometimes forget how huge Virginia is geographically. It's a very large state, and a lot of it is rural. I mean, we have the Golden Crescent. So, I think a stronghold for the Democrats has always been the Northern Virginia, Richmond, down to the Hampton Roads area. Do you see that kind of bleeding out any place other? I mean, Northern Virginia has been reliably Democratic for a while now. But do you see any of that bleeding out with this new redistricting around the Crescent?
No, I think there's less competitive seats than there used to be because those little blue dots that you talked about out in Western Virginia just aren't able to make seats competitive in the same ways that they were in the past. Democrats have to be able to rebuild in rural areas in order to make some of those seats competitive. But the urban Crescent continues to get stronger for Democrats every cycle. Suburban voters, particularly post-Roe, have been breaking towards Democratic candidates in swing elections. I don't think you're going to see that change this year unless the Republicans are very successful turning out their base.
So speaking of that, you bring up, abortion. We have not talked about the issues that these Democratic nominees are going to run on in the general. I think everyone agrees that abortion and access to abortion rights, especially since Virginia is like the lone southern state where you still have open access to abortion. What do you see as some of the other issues that Democrats will be running on?
Guns, environment, schools, I think will be the core Democratic issues. I think you'll hear Republicans talk about their core issues: taxes, pro-life, pro-gun. I think it's going to be a very predictable election.
And education, that has gotten to be such a crazy, banning books and targeting transgender children. I mean, once upon a time you would have thought that, protecting children and focusing on education, which is highly prized in almost every community, education gets more of the budget than anything else. And yet here we are, parental rights is suddenly which parents get to decide who has any rights.
Yeah, this whole Glenn Youngkin thing with parental rights, to me, has always been a myth. If you look at the places where there's a lot of young parents, Terry McAuliffe vastly overperformed in that election. Where Glenn Youngkin had his revolt and where he had all of his successes where grandparents live. It's rural areas. It was a revolt of grandparents. That was not a revolt of parents. Take Loudoun County, for example. Terry won it by double digits. That had voted for Ed Gillespie in the last pre-Trump election in 2014 over Mark Warner. Mm-hmm. He carried Loudoun County. Republicans were talking about Loudoun County the entire election in 2021 about how this was the center of Glenn Youngkin's revolution. And he got crushed in Loudoun County. He got crushed in Prince William County. This was not a parents' revolt, but in the areas where there were older voters, we'll call them the grandparents, they are mad as hell about what's going on in the schools and some of the social issues, and they are coming out to the tune of, in some areas, 98 or 99% return rates from the presidential election, and that's what elected Glenn Youngkin.
Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Since there's normally a huge drop-off between presidential and gubernatorial. So those voters on the Republican side came back.
They came back in the rural areas. They were running out of ballots because they'd never seen turnout like that before.
That's crazy. Well, I don't know whatever happened to CRT. Apparently critical race theory was here and now it's gone because I never hear anybody talking about it. Do you?
Not in this campaign, no.
No, and I think it was just kind of a very interesting political device that got a governor elected and has poof disappeared into the thin air from whence it cometh. But anyway, I want to say thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate you being here. This is always an education for me. I hope it's an education for all of our viewers at home too. And I just want to encourage everybody to realize that we have a general election coming up in November, that you can vote 45 days in advance. You can vote absentee and sign up to get a permanent absentee ballot. All of these things are available to you as voters here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And let me just say, every vote counts. And this is both a privilege and it's a responsibility. And I hope everybody within earshot understands that you don't want to cede your right to democracy to your next door neighbor, and how much you like them. Thank you so much. This has been Catherine Reed, today's host for Inside Scoop.